Today we're going to take a look at what is called the quadratic formula, but to set it up, first we're going to take this generic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c. We're going to pretend like a, b, and c are numbers, and we're going to solve this by completing the square. The process is the same. It's going to look weird with the letters, but the process we should know by now. The process says first we get rid of that constant term at the end by subtracting it from both sides. When we do that, we get ax squared plus bx equals a negative c. Our second step then is to get rid of that front term, the a. We do that by dividing each term by a on both sides of the equation. That's going to give us x squared plus b over ax equals negative c over a. Now, step 3 is to find that magic number that's going to make the left side into a perfect square. And we get that by playing with that middle term, the b over a. We divide it by 2 and square it, but instead of dividing by 2, because that's weird with fractions, I'm going to multiply by 1/2 and square it. So we have b over 2a, and we're going to square that. Well, to square a fraction, we square each part, b squared over 2 squared is 4, a squared, and so our magic number for this weird guy is b squared over 4a squared. So what do we do with it? We add it to both sides. Add b squared over 4a squared. Add b squared over 4a squared. That makes the left side x squared plus b over a, x, plus b squared over 4a squared equals, on the right side to add them together, we need to get a common denominator. This time the common denominator is 4a squared, so we need to multiply top and bottom by another 4a. And that gives us a common denominator of 4a squared. And in the numerator, I'm going to put the b squared first because it's positive and it looks better. We have b squared minus a 4a and a c. All right. From here, our last step is to factor the left side into a perfect square. It factors really quickly. We take the square root of x squared, which is x, sign from the middle, which is plus, and the square root of the fraction, the square root of b squared is b, the square root of 4 is 2, the square root of a squared is a, so we have x plus b over 2a squared equals the weird b squared minus 4ac all over 4a squared. We've now completed the square and made it into something that's really easy to solve. Remember, our goal is to solve for the x. We get rid of the square by taking the square root of both sides. Square and square roots are opposite. We're left with x plus b over 2a equals, that numerator is really weird on the right side. We cannot take the square root, but remember we need that plus or minus. The square root of b squared minus 4ac all over. We can take the square root of the denominator. The square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of a squared is a, which is really nice because when we try and get x by itself by subtracting b over 2a, we have x as alone equal to, we have a common denominator of 2a, but the numerators, there's not much we can do with them. We've just got that negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. But what we've done is we have solved this equation. We've also created a general formula for any equation. If we know what a, b, and c are, we can use this formula to solve without going through all the steps of completing the square. We call this the quadratic formula. Anytime we've got an equation, I need to get my highlighter out. Anytime we have an equation, something times x squared plus something times x plus c equals 0. It must equal 0, that's important. We can solve with this beautiful equation called the quadratic formula. And we do not need to go through the steps of completing the square. Let me show you how beautiful this is. In our completing the square video, we solved negative 3x squared plus 24x plus 60 equals 0. It should equal 0. That's a typo. So we'll just add it on here, equals 0. And we solved it by going through all the steps of completing the square. But now we'll notice that a is the number in front of x squared, negative 3. b is the number in front of x, 24. And c is that constant term of 60. We're going to plug those into the quadratic formula. X is equal to the opposite of b, so negative 24, plus or minus the square root of b squared, 24 squared, minus 4 times a, which is negative 3, c, which is 60, all over 2 times a, which is negative 3. Now you're probably going to want a calculator to do some of these calculations. So I'm going to get my calculator out off screen here. I'm going to put in the calculator everything under the square root. 24 squared minus 4 times negative 3 times 60. And sometimes it helps, a negative times a negative is a positive, so that's really 4 times 3 times 60. And we're adding. So now we have negative 24 plus or minus the square root of 1,296 all over 2 times negative 3, we can do that too, is negative 6. The next thing I do is I check on my calculator to see, can I take the square root of 1,296? And sure enough, I can. That is 36. That's really nice. So we have negative 24 plus or minus 36 divided by negative 6. Since we have this plus or minus, we're really dealing with two equations. One equation where I add them, and one equation where I subtract them. So let's add them first. Negative 24 plus 36 is 12 divided by negative 6. And 12 divided by negative 6 is negative 2. The other option, though, we also have to subtract. So negative 24 minus 36 is negative 60. Divided by negative 6 is positive 10. So our two answers are x equals negative 2 or x equals 10. The simplifying is a little cumbersome, but we don't have to go through all of those steps of completing the square when we have the quadratic formula. Let's take a look at one more example. This example is a little different than the previous because it does not equal 0. It is required that the equation equals 0 first. So we're going to add 1 to both sides. And that gives us 4x squared minus 7x plus 1 equals 0. Now that it equals 0, we can see that a equals 4, b equals negative 7, and c equals 1. All we have to do is plug this into the quadratic formula, which is the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all over 2a. That's a formula you should memorize, that x is equal to. If you want to find a song to help you memorize it, go on to YouTube and search quadratic formula song. There's tons of versions out there. I'm not going to sing to you on this video, but you need to memorize this formula. Let's see what happens when we plug in. So x is equal to the opposite of b, so the opposite of negative 7 is positive 7, plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is negative 7 squared, minus 4a, which is 4, times c, which is 1, all over 2a, which is 4. I'm going to plug the square root part into my calculator. Negative 7 squared minus 4 times 4 times 1 is 33. So we have 7 plus or minus the square root of 33, don't lose that square root, over 2 times 4, which is 8. What's really nice about this problem, we can't take the square root of 33. There's nothing else to do here, which means this is my final answer, 7 plus or minus the square root of 33 divided by 8. And if you remember, we actually solved this exact problem using completing the square in our prior video. However, using the quadratic formula, we didn't have to deal with the ugly fractions, the ugly simplifying, the ugly common denominators. This was much nicer using the quadratic formula. Opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. As soon as you have that memorized, solving quadratics is going to be a breeze. Good luck on the homework, and let your instructor know if you have any questions.